So today is our symbolic Holy Saturday, often called the Sabbath of Sabbaths, the in-between day, the day between death and resurrection, the day of waiting, the day of not knowing. So let's just be in that, and Jacqui will lead us off with a wonderful reading. You can follow along in the booklet if you care to.
This reading from Matthew's Gospel. Many women were there, watching from a distance, the same women who had followed Jesus from Galilee and looked after him. Among them were Mary of Magdala, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of Zebedee's sons. When it was evening, there came a rich man of Arimathea called Joseph, who had himself become a disciple of Jesus. This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Pilate thereupon ordered it to be handed over. So Joseph took the body, wrapped it in a clean shroud, and put it in his own tomb, which he had hewn out of the rock. And he then rolled a large stone across the entrance of the tomb and went away. Now, Mary of Magdala and the other Mary were there, sitting opposite the tomb. Sitting opposite the tomb. Sitting Shiva, as would have been the custom of all her Jewish community in that time and today, sitting opposite the tomb, having watched her Rabboni die an executed rabbi, sitting opposite the tomb in a space of not knowing, in a space of grief and not understanding. We can't even call it a liminal space because she doesn't really know what's happening next. And on the third day, I'll rise again. On the third day, the temple will be rebuilt. But she doesn't really know that this death isn't final. So she's just waiting. Waiting for the 7 days to go by. Waiting for her tears to perhaps change from a waterfall of grief to a trickle. Waiting in an unknown space. In an indecisive space. Waiting maybe in a space between faith and doubt, and faith again. But there's no evidence to assuage her, to comfort her. There's no tangible indication that life will have the last word. Not then. And so we, like Mary, are often waiting without proof texting, waiting without evidence, waiting between faith and doubt and faith again. That with all the evidence of death around us, life. With all the evidence of suffering around us, life. With all the evidence of violence around us, life. with the evidence of fear around us, life, just waiting right there, outside the tomb, with no answer, really, to our questions, except that we are not actually alone while we wait. Because even though he's in the tomb, he's still Christ.
And let's let that be our call and response. Some of you recognize it's from that opening of the book where I quote at length the Englishwoman Carol Houselander. For many people, it's a very telling phrase, because I don't think we were always sure of that. We thought Christ was gone. And of course, Carol says this in the context of people she met on the street who were homeless, people who had no faith, people who were addicts, people in the jail. Maybe you could call them Christ in the tomb, but they're still Christ. Any of you who've been to Latin American Catholic churches, we're usually a bit aghast at these statues they often have in Mexico and South of the dead Christ under the altar. And I think for the poor, it's not a morbid or scary statue. This is the message. Christ in the tomb is still Christ. That's good news, because you and I all have our days where if we don't feel like Christ in the tomb, no energy, no spiritual excitement, mostly spiritual boredom. Those are most of the days of all of our lives, aren't they? So let's use this as our call and response, but as we're doing it, try to think of people, situations, countries that right now appear to be Christ in the tomb. Repeat after me. Christ in the tomb is still Christ.
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 So we're going to leave time for a little longer sit this morning, almost to reflect the Mary waiting opposite the tomb. No answers, no nothing. And we're going to risk sitting in that nothingness, seeming emptiness without answers. And it's uncomfortable for all of us. We don't know what to do with our racing mind. We don't know what to do with our non-answers. My mind, at least, wants to rush toward closure, rush toward resolution. We're going to again return to the book of Lamentations, that lesser-known book that follows Jeremiah. And let's read this together. If you don't have the booklet, I think it's going to be
On the screen.
on the screen. Just give you a minute if you're going to use the booklet. So read with me. God is good to those whose hope is in God, to the one who seeks God. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a human to bear the yoke while they are young. Let him sit alone in silence, for the Lord has laid it on him. Let her bury her face in the dust. There may yet be hope. Let them offer their cheek to the one who would strike them, and let them be filled with disgrace. For no one is cast off
by the
Lord forever. Though there is grief, God will show compassion. So great is God's unfailing love. Be still and know that I am God.
Know that I am God.
Be still and know that I am.
Be still and know that I am.
Be still and know.
Be still and know.
Be still.
Be still.
Be.
Be.
And let's live well in this Holy Saturday, as it were, and make it a Holy Saturday, not by our actions, but by our Sabbath rest. Okay, well, as I said before, or maybe indirectly said before, I think what became the contemplative stance that most of the major religions of the world, if not all, discovered with different language and different vocabulary, can be very directly associated with the Jewish idea of Sabbath. That at least 1/7 of the week was to be directly and seriously concerned with not doing, not producing, not performing, not attaining. And somehow that became a prescription for maybe mental health, but certainly spiritual health. And that's really at the heart of contemplation. Not. Because we're so inclined toward performance, achievement, accomplishment. And we have to deliberately be trained. It became a commandment among our Jewish forebears. Don't do anything today. And that's what we're doing each time we sit in silence before the Lord, before the moment. We're saying, who am I before I do anything right or anything wrong, just in my naked being? Because we all think we attain our worthiness. And if there's one message that the center is trying to communicate, it's what I am now calling ontological holiness, that comes with the manufacturing from the beginning. It's not attained by any moral behavior whatsoever. And yet it is so hard for us to think that could be true. It's absolute, it's objective, it's equally shared. Image of Christ, image of Christ, image of Christ, image of Christ. I really don't care your religious affiliation, your gender, your nationality, how much money you make. Those are all what we used to call in scholastic philosophy accidents. But they weren't substance. The substance is you are objectively, metaphysically, ontologically, theologically children of God. And yet it's an unlearning that allows us to sink back into that. It's not a learning. And that of itself is so counterintuitive. I think many of us are being forced into that today with sort of unlearning so much that we were taught. It's an exercise in letting go, not holding on to what we think are our perfect answers. And they never are. Come on, they never are. Look in our lifetimes how our understanding of things, I hope, has changed again and again. What you thought, well, that was a youthful understanding. That was a teenage understanding. That was a young adult. That was a first half of life, climbing the ladder of success. But really, contemplation is the prayer form of the second half of life, where you stop even performing before God or for God, and you learn ever so slowly how to rest in who you have been since the beginning. In Thomas Merton's final and only video, that he made the hour before he died in Bangkok. He said, "It's all a matter of becoming who you already are." Wow. Now, I don't mean this to come out in a cynical way, but I do think we who were ordained and formal ministers, we weren't too inclined to teaching you that. Can you figure out maybe why? Now, it's wonderful, and many ministers are in this room today, how many are recognizing that. But once we have liturgy that is controlled by ministers and priests and professionals and the theologically trained, and we certainly need that, when our very prayer life depends upon it, oftentimes it seems to me Catholics don't know what to do when they're together except have Mass. Father, will you have Mass for us today? And then they can get into their very passive role, and it's watching the priest. I know all the historical reasons why that happened, and let's be sympathetic about it. But consciousness has changed, and we're ready for adult Christianity, where I don't need a mediator to know God. And that's at the foundation. It's the foundation of contemplative prayer. That you can pray on the toilet, you can pray in the shower, you can pray on the bus, you can pray as Carol Houselander did on the London Tube, as they now call it. It really doesn't matter. Churches are nice, but you do know until 313, correct me if I'm wrong on this, Dom, but the word church applied to the people. And then after we started identifying with basilicas, rather quickly, we went to the top, the best mansions in town, and they still are in most villages, and that's okay. Again, we don't want to be dualistic about these things. But for most people, the word church implies a building, not a collection of people. I'm convinced Jesus' basic ecclesiology was 2 or 3 gathered in my name. And he said, there I am in their midst. Just as strong a promise of presence as the promise in the bread or in the word, in the community of something as simple as 2 or 3 gathered in my name. That's the beginnings of real church, when 2 or 3 get it and share it. And it is a long leap from 2 or 3 gathered in a little house in Syria to St. Peter's in Rome. How did that happen? Well, it was probably inevitable. Really, don't spend too much time hating it. We have to build shrines to remind ourselves of who we think we are. But the trouble is, the buildings become an end in themselves, their decoration and their maintenance. I remember last time I was in England, I joked with some of my Anglican minister friends, and I said, you stole these churches from us Catholics. And they all say, well, we'd be happy to give them back. Because it's costing us $1 million a day to keep them maintained, Oh, my. So, this isn't what I'm supposed to be talking about, is it? Well, it really is, I hope. Because the Sabbath day is the day of unlearning, of not knowing. Now, those of you familiar with the earlier period in the church, like our own Lee Stamen, who's an expert in that period, you know that there were 2 strains of spirituality. And they emerged sort of organically, but eventually we gave them names. Now, you don't have to write down these names. You don't even need to remember them. One was called the cataphatic tradition. to know the divine and the holy through images and words and even concepts and figures, statues, rituals that were somehow visible. And that pretty much took over. There was another strain that was meant to keep it in balance. And the cataphatic tradition was balanced by the apophatic. And the apophatic was always a subtext, except among hermits and recluses. And it was knowing God by silence. Not knowing God through the word, but through no words. And I can't tell you how brilliant that was. But there's only two outstanding texts. One written by a figure who is unfortunately called Pseudo Dionysius. Well, he isn't pseudo, but that's the name he gave himself, or we gave to him, I guess. And he makes a whole science out of unlearning, unknowing. Whatever affirmation you make, follow it by a negation. God is good, but God is not good in any way that you and I can imagine goodness. God is supremely good. Here's your early triad thinking, your early Hegelian synthesis. God is love, but God is not love in any way you and I can understand love. God is supremely, infinitely love. And let's check how much of infinite is half of infinite. You see, but we just weren't prepared to think that way unless we do some unlearning and allow ourselves to at least partially exist in the realm of mystery, where I don't have to nail it down, because we can't nail it down anyway. That's an illusion. Now, I've always been convinced that was the warning in the book of Genesis. You may eat of all of the trees in the garden, which is quite a huge permission, really. God's saying, take all kind of risks, try everything, feel all the feelings you can, as Rilke says. But he says there is one tree of which you must not eat. And it seems like a tree that we should eat of. It's really, talk about paradox language. I mean, I had 4 years of moral theology. I was trained to know the difference between good and evil. But it was only my limited, partial, cultural, Catholic, Western, male understanding of God, how it couldn't be anything else. So he warned us, God warned us, she warned us at the beginning to eat of all of the trees in the garden but one. Do not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. If you eat of it, you will most surely die. Oh my goodness, what does that mean? And I'm not saying this interpretation is the only one, or for me it's the best one, but you see, it was supposed to plant an element of radical humility at the beginning of religion, knowing that you don't know. Haven't you, by your time in life, discovered so many things that you thought were good are only partially good, including yourself? So many things that you thought were bad and terrible, you're rather disappointed to find out, oh, she's got some good qualities, damn it. I had so decided to hate her with good justification, and then I work with her all day and I feel, wow, this woman has some virtue. Or it's always true. I've told the story to the living school class many times that I was 14 years the jail chaplain right across the plaza from here. And I would read in the Albuquerque newspapers about people who had killed or raped or abused. And I really would go to the jail with fear that I would meet them. And I'd have to talk to them because I was so filled with resentment toward them for the evil things they had done. And then I had the very fortunate experience of being asked to visit them alone in their cell. I can't think of a single one, including a woman who tore a baby out of another woman's chest with a key. Remember that? Because she wanted a baby so bad. And I didn't want to meet this woman. And I met her. And I talked with her for an hour. And as many have said of God, to know all is to forgive all. It's all based on ignorance, this certitude that we've come to. And let me give you just a bit of history, if it isn't too boring. How did we get into what I now call a lust for knowledge that became a lust for certitude and created the highly opinionated country we have today, where people are their certain knowledge. And knowledge has become ammunition, knowledge has become a weapon, knowledge has become a superiority contest. I know. I have eaten of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and I know your politics is 100% wrong. That's never true. Damn it. It's never true. But the ego finds a great comfort in that. I have a wonderful minister friend who sent me Peter Enns, his book, The Sin of Certitude. The Sin of Certitude. And he's building right on, thou shalt not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And I think most of us, especially when you're young and not that secure, where you want to enter the conversation with facts, with I know. There's even these people who wait till the end of the conversation and then just level you. I hope you're not one of those. With what they've been waiting to reveal that they know. So what healthy religion gives to us is a humility around knowing. All spiritual knowing, and I think I mean this as an almost absolute statement. All knowledge of God is humble. Because once you've had a moment of the veil parting and an experience of the absolute, that alone is the absolute, the only appropriate response is humility. Knowing for a moment helps you know that you don't know it all, that we're all with beginner's mind. We're all in kindergarten. We're all just beginning to understand. And to use that phrase that is used commonly, those who know that they don't know. Those who know too quickly and break into the conversation with their little bit of certitude, it might be right. They might be totally right if that's possible. But in some way they're wrong. You know, if Jesus himself can say to the rich young man who comes flattering him and says, "Good master." I'm always afraid when people flatter me too much, you know. And Jesus comes back very quickly. "Why do you call me good?" Jesus said this, "Only God is good." That's what he said. There's only one absolute, only one. It's not your country, it's not your ethnicity, it's not your physical or emotional health, it's not your gender. I mean, that the poor Methodist church divides over gender. If they understood the true self and the false self, they know gender is an accident of the false self. Jesus says in heaven there will be no marriage or giving in marriage. He's not against marriage, but he's saying gender is an accident. It's going to pass. The true self is who you were in God, in the mind of God, from the moment of your conception. And that doesn't go up and down. It's not dependent upon gender. I don't know why we're spending so much time arguing about this. It for me, is an example of the immaturity of people who have PhDs in theology, but they don't know the difference between the true self and the false self. See, the false self is always decorating itself up with its knowledge, with its certitudes, with its moral divisions. It loves to split. And that's what mind allows you to do, to split from reality, to objectify it, and to look at it over there. In the Franciscan school, and we argued with the Dominicans about this, they were the smart order. They were much smarter than we were. And so all the smart boys joined the Dominicans. We lesser minds joined the Franciscans. And so naturally, smart as they were, they put veritas, truth, as the highest value. And I know what they were trying to say. I don't think they said it very well. But aren't I terrible? Talk about pride, huh? And the Franciscan school, see, we were the debating society in the 13th century, when the Catholic Church was the only game in town. So we had to have some room for discussion and debate. We almost always disagreed and would take alternating sides. But the Franciscan school said, yes, truth, but only for the sake of love. And if your truth doesn't lead you to be a loving person, at least for you, it's not truth. You follow me? And we saw that this obsession with I have the truth led us to burning people at the stake, justifying slavery and apartheid. Anything the ego wanted in any culture, it found the appropriate scripture because it was always certain. Now, after wonderful pseudo-Dionysius, and since I spoke ill of the Dominicans, let me say Thomas Aquinas, their greatest intellectual. Do you know, and this amazed me when I found out, the single person Thomas Aquinas quotes the most is pseudo-Dionysius. This rational, brilliantly intelligent 13th century theologian is always balancing himself with a quote from pseudo-Dionysius. 5th century is Lee wins pseudo. Oh, it doesn't matter. 6th century, 5th or 6th. Then the teaching directly is taught much later, and now we'll give the English credit, by an unknown writer. Now, when Cynthia went to Tintern Abbey, I think it's in Wales, I was there once, talk about beautiful. She was standing there praying, and she said she could feel the presence of the author of The Cloud of Unknowing. And her little witching stick, not really, but she just knew the author wrote it right here at Tintern Abbey in Wales, But it still stands as the classic, The Cloud of Unknowing. Now, where does that metaphor come from? To bring this back to Scripture, I want you to notice in all the major theophanies, there is invariably an epiphany, a seeing, a showing, a light, and almost without exception, if I count them correctly, it is followed by a cloud covering the light. Brilliant. on Mount Sinai and on Mount Tabor in the New Testament. There is a moment of knowing, and immediately the knowing is shrouded in unknowing. And with that, on Mount Tabor, Jesus invites the disciples, let's go down. And then this ambiguous line, don't talk about this to anyone. When the men when I used to give the male initiation rites, they would be so excited by the last day, and they'd all just couldn't wait to go home and tell their wife. And they said, you won't need to tell your wife, you know how wives are. They'll say, what happened? Well, I'm going to make you torture them and say, don't tell them anything for 3 days. Just say, oh, it's okay. Richard's sort of repetitive, and he's much shorter than I thought he'd be. I thought he'd be tall and handsome, you know. And I gave him a whole Grimm's fairy tale to justify doing that. Just don't talk about it. Just make them die of curiosity. I want to know what happened. You seem unduly excited, unduly happy. And women don't like anything their husbands experience that they're not in on. But and I'm sure it's true the other way around. But not so much. No, really. Women go away and have a wonderful conference, and he says, well, how was your weekend? Oh, that's nice, honey. And he really doesn't care to know that much more. So maybe we're better at not knowing. I never thought of that way before. First time I ever said that. So anyway, the real point of my little Grimm's fairy tale that illustrated this, I don't have time to go into it here, was to, the final line is, don't give away your gold until it's your gold. I want you to chew on it for 3 days. I want you not to quote Richard once. I want you to say, I know, not Richard told me. I want firsthand knowledge of your own experience, not someone else's re-chewed religious experience. And I think it often helped a great deal. So anyway, I wanted to give you those important scriptures. Notice how the cloud of knowing is always followed by the cloud of unknowing. When we can keep the cataphatic balanced with the apophatic, you know what we end up with? Biblical faith. I mean, that's the deepest understanding of biblical faith. But if you want to, you know, many have said, if you want to tell a lie, tell a really big lie. And one of the really big lies that overtook us after the Reformation, not blaming the Reformation, and the Enlightenment, was we turned the biblical meaning of faith around 180 degrees. And we made it into perfect knowing, perfect certitude, no doubt. And if there is a major weakness to Protestant theology, if you will allow me to say so, it's there's almost no teaching on darkness. By the 16th century, the contemplative older tradition had been lost, and that's why we've had 500 years of argumentation. Remember, the dualistic mind is always binary and therefore inherently competitive and argumentative. And you always take sides, the most common forms being called liberal or conservative. But when you don't need to be sure you're right, when you don't need to win the debate, when you're content with, it's not just not knowing, but not even needing to know. Have you enjoyed those days? You know, I really don't need to be right. I don't know how a marriage can survive. I've never been married, but you must have to some days just gulp. Okay, honey. I'll let you be right today. And what they say you have to ask is, would you rather be right or would you rather be in relationship? And most of us have been trained to be right, particularly if you're a 1 on the Enneagram. Avoid it at all costs. Oh, we get so much pleasure from being right. Now I'm going to read a little bit from Just This again. It's on page 85. Blaise Pascal, the French philosopher and savant, said that people, this is a direct quote, never do evil so completely and so cheerfully as when they do it from a religious conviction. Did you hear that? I'm going to read it again. People never do evil so completely and so cheerfully as when they do it from a religious conviction. René Girard said people would walk away from guillotines in France and I suppose lynchings in Mississippi, singing, we have killed evil. Be very hesitant to be too certain about who's in the right and who's in the wrong. You might be surprised. And could that be what Jesus means? I think it must be when he says the last will be first and the first will be last. Be prepared to be surprised. I bet that young girl who wanted a baby so bad she tore another woman's belly open with a key. I'll bet she's going to be there. I'm convinced of it. There is no right group. Blaise Pascal recognized that a little bit of a good thing is often a very bad thing. When you know just a little bit and take it as if it's the whole story. There's no right group, there's no right ritual that will assure your transformation. Each group produces major saints. There's little contemplatives hidden in every one of your denominations. Merton called them masked contemplatives. They don't do all the practices that we do. Barbara Holm was the wonderful black theologian who's going to continue to keep joining us if we have anything to say about it. She has really helped us to realize what she calls crisis contemplation. And she uses the history of her own black people coming across the Middle Passage in slave holds where bodies were chained to the floor of the ship across the whole traverse. And because many of them were from different tribes, they couldn't even talk to one another. And they just had to lay there and moan. And those moans became the black spirituals. Listen to the depth of wisdom in almost all black spirituals. Now, they didn't practice our more monastic Buddhist form of contemplation like we did this morning, sitting in quiet, and there's a place for that. But if you have to do that to know God, you know we're in trouble. 99% of the human race is never going to know God. Mothers with 4 children or even 1 child don't have time to sit on a mat for 20 minutes, morning or night. Can they not know God? And so that's why I've always said, I think I say in this book too, the normal paths of transformation, which are the paths of knowing. So we're trying to get to a different way of knowing than intellectual cogitation, are great love and great suffering. And great love and great suffering have been available to humanity since the Stone Age. It didn't depend upon organized religion. It didn't depend upon ordained clergy, which of itself, and we Catholics have to take ownership of this is largely a created myth. You don't hear this intense difference between clergy and laity in the first 3 centuries. It's the people of God, the people of God. Now, naturally, they needed leaders with many roles and many ministries, but we sucked them all into one role and one ministry and called them priests. That is a terrible imbalance, I think. And it's part of what people are abandoning now, it seems to me. So each group produces major saints and also major pushback against those saints. Healthy religion is always humble about its own holiness, its own knowledge. It knows that it does not know. If you don't see humility in a Christian, they're not there yet. I'm not saying they're bad. I'm not saying they're not good. They are good, but they're still at the beginnings of the path. And when you see this arrogance around knowing, well, I meant to give you a little more of the history before. So by the 16th century, coterminous with Luther's wonderful rebellion, I went to the castle myself and nailed the 8 principles of the CAC on Würzburg. I did. They tore it down right away. It didn't. Yeah, that was wonderful. And then they took a picture of me lying on the ground, struck dead by God. I have a lot of fun friends who like to do things like that. So anyway, coterminous with that wonderful German Augustinian monk was, the invention of the printing press. Right in the same decade, the same period. So suddenly humanity can know verbally, left brain, with certitude. Don't hate us medieval Catholics too much. Do remember, I'm sure you know, I hope you know, that 95% of them couldn't read or write. That's why we got into all these statues and art and mosaic, and we looked, we contemplated, we didn't read. And I don't think we took the Bible away from them. It's just no one could read the Bible, which tells me to know God, please don't hate me, cannot depend upon reading the Bible. I'm sorry, it can't. It can't. The Bible was written in the last nanosecond of geological time. Did God just start talking in 1517? I don't think so. God has been talking since the first incarnation in all things created. That's the visibility of God. The early Franciscans said, the first Bible is creation. And nature doesn't allow you this absolute knowing. And we're still discovering. And you know where I find that humility? In people who are scientists, who do know that they don't know, that they're still discovering it. Some of the doctors that I'm working with now are the same way. They're so eager to read another book about this new illness. The only group that seems to be absolutely certain are clergy. We know, yes sir, we know. But again, I keep getting off my supposed point. So first we have this antagonism emerging. Once you have 2 groups, you've got to prove that your group is 100% wrong, and the previous group that you usually hate the most is 100%, we're right and they're wrong. Then, about a century later, after a century of heady reading, something emerges with the strangest of names. It's called the Enlightenment. They stole our word. That's supposed to be our word, enlightenment. Well, more the Eastern religions than the West. But for 2 centuries, most of the 17th and 18th centuries, rationalism triumphed. And you know what happened? We started feeling we weren't a part of the intelligent conversation in Europe or North America. That's why we created these Christian universities, hardly any of which are Christian anymore, but most of which started under the auspices of Christianity. But we didn't fit in the conversation ourselves anymore because we had very limited bandwidth of authority, sola scriptura. I love Luther, but sola scriptura is a basis for dualistic thinking. That means no other basis for truth, no other basis for basic observation. Then you have to find a line in the Bible. We're in trouble. And it led, in my opinion, directly to the fundamentalism we have today, where people don't know how to read reality, but they find their certainty in a very selectively read Bible passage. But we had to go through that. So, that's right. Then what happens after they become rational, we withdraw from the intelligent conversation, and we have pretty much withdrawn, so that most scientists today are agnostics or even atheists because they can't dialogue with us. They find truth on another basis, and we have such a limited basis for truth. Well, by the middle of the 19th century, it had grown to such a crisis that both the Catholic and the Protestant forms looked for some ground to stand on, something solid. We wanted an absolute basis for authority. And in almost the same decade, we Catholics declared that the Pope was infallible, and the Protestants, not all of them, declared that the Bible was inerrant. You do know we got along 1900 years without an inerrant Bible. You do know that, right? Augustine said 4 to 8 levels of interpretation. And the 4 Gospels told us right in front, there's 4 ways of communicating the same gospel story. So which one is inerrant? Come on. We turned off our heads. Mark makes a very different point than Luke, and Luke makes a very different point than John. Which one is true? They're all true. But that's non-dual thinking. And if you have a lust for certitude and for perfect knowing, you won't know how to get there. But you've got to know, sisters and brothers, all of us in this room, if you're from the Christian lineage, we are products of that lust for certitude that took over in the middle of the 19th century, made us all retreat into our little camps of infallible popes. I mean, the popes never claimed to be infallible, but we needed it so bad when everybody was leaving the church that we said, well, our pope doesn't say wrong things. I would like to fill a book this much with ridiculous things that popes have said. Ridiculous. What is this ability to turn off our heads? It's this lust for certitude. And once we grab, which is what the ego does, remember the Velcro theory, it grabs around something that gives it security. It lets go of anything that makes it let go. And we don't want to release our grip on being right, on being separate, and on being superior. So I know, as I've often done, I just walk around these things. I hope you got the major point in there somewhere. So the true biblical notion of faith, which balances knowing with not knowing, knowing enough to not need to know everything. Hear that? Knowing enough to not needing to know everything, not needing to be right. I've just saved your marriage. I really have. She needs to be right tonight. Let her have it. That's all right. This balancing of knowing and not knowing is rather rare today, especially among religious folk who think faith is being certain all the time. with almost no theology of doubt. Remember how many people were scandalized by Mother Teresa's journals when she said she went, it was almost 2 decades, almost identical to Teresa of Avila, without a single moment of religious consolation, just living in pure darkness. But darkness, frankly, is the language of the Sufi mystics and the Catholic mystics. And the Hindu mystics too, but most of the rest, it wasn't about darkness. It was about knowing, light, clarity, and certitude. Medieval theology called this docta ignorantia, learned ignorance. Isn't that a good phrase? Learn. So let's learn how to be ignorant, huh? And find freedom in that. It really is quite a recipe for happiness, because you will not be in this inner argumentative state 24 hours a day. Let me end, since we have a number of Irish here, and we always must please the Irish. I quote this poem to my living school classes during their intensive, so some of you have heard this. It's by an Irishman, I think he's still alive, Brendan Kennelly. Is he, Dom? Is he still alive? He was born in 1936 in Ballylongford, County Kerry. Listen closely. This is, for me, a masterpiece. What is it that gives the Irish that gift of words? They tell me they have Blarney. No, I don't think it's that. They tell me it's that they have to memorize poems and Shakespeare already in grade school. Memorize them and repeat them back. That must give you a taste for words. The poem is called A Giving, and it's in Kennelly's book, Familiar Strangers. Here in this room, this December day, listening to the year die on the war fields, and in the voices of children who laugh in the indecisive light. Wow, laughing while the light is indecisive. At the throes that but rehearse their own, I take the mystery of giving into my hands, and I am now passing it on to you. I give thanks to the giver of images, the reticent God who goes about his work determined to hold on to nothing. He's got that Gaelic Trinitarian spirituality. You'll see it through the rest of the poem. The reticent God who goes about his work determined to hold on to nothing, embarrassed at the prospect of possession, the self-emptying God. He lets them pitch and leap like boys. He lets nature and reality take its errant dead ends, capering out of their skin. For such things as this, and bearing in mind the midnight hurt, the shot bride, the famine in the heart, the demented soldier, the terrified cities rising out of their own rubble, I still give thanks. I listen to the sound of doors opening and closing in the streets. They are like the heartbeats of the Creator who gives everything away. I do not understand such constant evacuation of the heart. Oh, God, I wish I'd written that. That's just such constant evacuation of the heart, such striving toward emptiness. Thinking, however, of the intrepid skeleton, the feared definition, I grasp a little of the giving, just a little. That's all any of us do. A little of the giving, and I hold it close as my own flesh. It is this little that I give to you today. And now, I want to walk out and witness the shadow of some ungraspable sweetness. Witness the shadow of some ungraspable sweetness passing over the measureless squalor of humanity. Darkness and light, like a child's hand over my own face, or the exodus of swallows across the land. And here's his ending. And I now know it does not matter that I do not understand. God bless you.